edit it, beforehand, so that's okay. If there's just a few little noises. Okay. So let's just count down from 3, and then I'll bring you in. And so, could you clap your hands as well? That way, the sound wave makes a spike. It's easier to sync the sound. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. I'm here with Johan Norberg. Johan, welcome to the Policy People podcast.
Thank you very much.
I'm so excited to have you on. You've written some amazing books, and the one we're going to discuss today, Open, A Story of Human Progress, is a fascinating one. And I think this is so relevant and so timely, considering everything that's going on in the world right now, especially in policy. It's very fashionable to talk about decoupling. It's very fashionable to talk about the retreat of globalization or deglobalization. But your book is real testament to the value of open societies and cosmopolitanism throughout history. And I found it very moving, an account of human history, and it affirmed quite a few things for me. And so there's so much I want to dive in to with you today, Johan. So I'd like to set up the context for the book first. What is the relationship between Open and your previous book, Progress? Also, I just quickly noticed the structure is more thematic. You have chapters such as Open Mind, Open Doors, Zero Sum, and within these chapters you weave together different historical analogies and parts, picked from various corners of the earth at during various epochs. So it's more of a thematic structure, but I could have seen how this could have easily been done chronologically or even perhaps regionally, between maybe East and West, etc. So I'm just really curious, maybe from a writer's perspective, why did you choose that structure as well? And did you consider any others? So please, let us explore.
Well, those are great questions. Thank you very much. This is really my prequel to Progress, because Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, was also a thematic work on progress in 10 different walks of life, spheres of human experience, on how we've managed to combat poverty, illiteracy, hunger, and many of the scourges that have affected mankind. But I didn't, in that book, so much go into detail on why did that happen, to talk about the foundations, the institutions, the thoughts that made progress possible. And that's what Open is about. That's really how openness creates progress. And I wanted to look at that from a historical perspective, look at different civilizations and places, but also to go into the various forms of openness, because it's not just the fact that you have an open society or you don't. It's in which terms are societies and institutions open to surprises, which I really think is the common denominator. Open to surprises, surprising new ideas or business models or technologies or discoveries from other places or from within society, from new groups, from minority groups or eccentrics and entrepreneurs. And therefore, I thought that looking into openness in terms of markets, doing it in terms of minds, ideas, free speech, and then looking at it how missionaries, migrants, and merchants from other places contribute to openness, that would be interesting, even though I could have cut the cake in other ways as well.
Yes, no, it's a fascinating exploration, and you have so many contradictions sort of woven throughout the book. It is, I would say, quite an optimistic book on the whole, and it definitely reminds us of the value of openness, but there is another element to it, and that is competition. In essence, the fact that you do acknowledge very clearly the tribalism that runs throughout human societies in all epochs, but how that sometimes manifests itself in a deconstructive way, but at other times it manifests itself in a constructive way, and being open becomes like the competitive advantage for certain societies. So that sort of leads me to my next question, because there is this inherent contradiction that I just mentioned there. You basically start the book by saying that open societies have always been more prosperous than closed ones, but it is from being open and cooperating with others, but this instinct was born in order to compete with other groups. So I would just be really curious as to why you think that is, and perhaps does that explain why we often see times of war as also being the times where we have these great big leaps in innovation of all kinds, medical and technological. How does that sort of sit within your book?
Yeah, I think this has a very, very long background in mankind's prehistory, because cooperation and exchange made us conquer the planet. We weren't particularly strong or quick. Humans can't even fly. We're not very good at swimming, and yet we conquered the world. And that's because we cooperated. We broadcasted our intention to others, and so we could start helping one another on the hunt or the gathering. And then whatever ideas anybody else came up with, we could borrow those ideas. So we were the first free traders. We managed to constantly exchange favors, ideas, goods, services, technologies with one another, and then the sky is the limit. But it means once we climb to the top of the food chain in that way, it means that the only threat to us in the future is not another predator, it's other groups of people who cooperate even better. And that's why we're not just traders, we're also tribalists, and we have to be acutely aware of what are the others up to, and in a bit of an oversensitive way as well, because in that nasty, brutish and short prehistory, failing to understand the bad intentions of another group, that's the end of it. We're out of the gene pool. So we're oversensitive. Any kind of cue that tells us that they're disloyal, they're up to no good, triggers this tribalist instinct within us. And that's obviously the difficult thing to manage today when we meet strangers and other groups all the time, and why we might fall for tribalism, racism, and nationalism all the time. But I do think that it contributes to this sense of we have to get going, we have to learn faster, we have to make more progress. The fact that if we don't, somebody else might do it. And obviously in times of war, then all the institutional barriers to coming up with inventions and implementing them, all our natural conservatism fades away, because we know that now it's us or them. This might be the end of it. So I don't think that we're necessarily much more inventive during wartime, but at least it makes us think that let's just skip ahead a few years and avoid this natural tendency to avoid to implement new technologies and discoveries.
I think that's a good way to frame it. I mean, people don't get suddenly more creative during times of crisis, but there is an urgency, isn't there? It's simply do or die, and so it's kind of like, let's take our foot off the brakes and just run with some wild ideas if we think those ideas have a chance of giving us an edge on our competitor. It is
exactly, and any kind of a crisis situation can trigger that as well. Look at the pandemic. We always knew how to do these discussions online. We always knew that we could have telemedicine and do education online as well. But we don't want to change our ways unless we have to. And then suddenly we jump ahead a couple of years.
It's that complacency factor. And you also just brought up something else there about the point in evolutionary history when suddenly humans didn't really have any other natural sort of threat or competitor. There was a brief part about the Neanderthals, which is quite interesting. But I also have this other sort of side thought that, and I know many people have spoken about this before, it's kind of like the idea of would the thing that actually causes humanity to unite, by that logic, would it fundamentally be some sort of an alien invasion? Because maybe at that point, or potentially, as some other futurists or people have speculated, I think this century could be AI, something like that. It does seem that for those of us who have a deep hope and an optimism for a sort of a much more globalized and cosmopolitan world where these barriers are reduced between peoples, from a realist perspective, it seems that inherently we may need to, encounter some other superhuman force I don't know if you have any ideas on that. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting, and it's hotly contested because, yes, historically we've been very good at finding new common ground with strangers and constantly encircling our sphere of empathy, if you will, or at least of peaceful cooperation with strangers and other groups, because we realize what we have in common. It used to be just our kin, and then suddenly it's our village, and then suddenly it's our faith or our nation. I mean, some people think that nationalism is sort of the deepest, most natural basis of community, but it's brand new in history. It's bizarre in a way that we feel like we've got something in common with strangers who just happen to be within that sort of those national borders. So nationalism in itself is proof that we can enlarge this circle of empathy. So
Yes.
what's next? Is there any way to find mutual ground with everybody on the planet without meeting an alien civilization? Well, I think there is. And it might be that we've already discovered this in open societies based on decentralization and individualism, because in those areas we do have common enemies or a common them all the time, but who them is differs all the time, because I'm not just Swedish or a classical liberal, I'm also a father who is interested in intellectual history, who listens to electronic music and goth, who plays tennis, which means that I can unite with my other electronic music fans against sort of the heavy metal group. I can, as a tennis player, I unite against the soccer players, or those who are interested in that. And we can constantly, and I think we find this online in our online communities, that we have all these fragmented identities in a way where we can find incredibly strong mutual ground with strangers just because we happen to share one slice of our identity or of our preferences. And we can feel like we've got something in common, even though we don't share the same mother tongue, we live on different parts of the planet, and we might hate the political ideas of the others. But we do have this fact that we're parents, or we play, we love Roger Federer as a tennis player or something like that. And this, to me, is a bit hopeful, because it means that as long as that is not drowned out in sort of the tribalist drums of certain demagogues who want to tell us that there's just one slice of our identity that's important, well, then we can find common ground constantly, all the time.
And it gives us a lot more flexibility as to who we associate with, so we're not sort of locked in. There are some there is definitely an optimistic side to that. There were a couple of tragic incidents you referred in the book where this kind of, I think as you called it at one point, the fickleness of, or the endless fickleness with which humans sort of, their loyalties and the categories kind of cross over. We might come back to that later. Right? I don't want to jump ahead. But there is definitely something to be said about in an age where we can all be interconnected, we can connect with each other on opposite sides of the globe, you being in Sweden, myself being in Taiwan right now, there is ample opportunity to actually have our identities become more of a smorgasbord, and therefore less sort of zero sum and less unidimensional, so hopefully less conflict ridden as well. So I just like to ask, I guess, what you feel about the relationship between cosmopolitanism as a political ideology and free market economics, because they seem to go hand in hand throughout the book. And so I wonder, is it possible to have one without the other in your thinking? And is this ever desirable by societies? I can't think of too many examples, but perhaps off the top of my head, maybe newly independent India in the 50s and 60s was very, India had a very, very progressive and inclusive constitution and has a very highly tolerant, diverse society internally, but externally it erected a lot of barriers to free trade and was quite a state-led domestic economy. I don't know what you might make of that particular example, but do you think generally that these two sort of always go together, or not always? And yeah, just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, I share your general the general direction of the question. I think there is something there definitely that makes free markets and become more cosmopolitan in a way, and none other than Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels pointed this out, that there's something about constantly finding a way to create mutual benefit with strangers and with outsiders and with foreigners, because it's in your mutual benefit, tears down many of our bigoted attitudes, because being bigoted, being racist, of course, those prejudices exist in any society, but at least in free markets, it's costly. It's costly to discriminate and to avoid, to do business with, to hire, to promote the people who are the most, who could contribute most to your project. Friedrich Engels said at some point that trade has an aspect wherein it pays homage to morality and humanity, because the more friendly, the more advantageous. And of course, this is instrumental in a way. And Engels thought that it doesn't come from the purity of your heart, it comes from your own self-interest. But hey, being able to turn being friendly and open-minded into your own self-interest, isn't that one of the greatest benefits that we could do to mankind in a way? So I think it's there. At the same time, it's not always there, and obviously there are exceptions, and there have been many other ideologies which promoted cosmopolitanism and openness, and I think India, before the economic reforms of the 1990s, that is an interesting example to look at. What I would say, when I look at India, when I've traveled to India and talked to people, and especially people from lower castes, how they have been discriminated against, no matter what the law has said, no matter what the Indian ideology has said, they were always blocked from making a career, from doing business, from being promoted. Because as long as the system was entirely planned and regulated, well, then discrimination isn't costly. You can just promote your friends or people from your own caste. It's only from the 1990s and onwards that we've seen a beginning of tearing down the barriers, where even people from the traditionally lowest castes have been able to make progress. And I was very interested to listen to an interview with a former Marxist who became a Marxist to fight against caste discrimination in India, who said that recently he has abandoned Marxism because he realized that capitalism does it much, much faster than any kind of government ideology.
Well, that's fascinating example. No, that's a beautiful way of linking the two together. It is one's sort of selfish form of altruism, I suppose. Exactly. The market counters against discrimination because it's unprofitable, I suppose, to put it bluntly, and that's an interesting side to it. We typically like to be cosmopolitan, open-minded, because it's the moral thing to do, and all of that. But there are economic dimensions to it, as well as your book so vividly attests to that. We would
and let me just say
jump in.
one thing here, because it's what happens after a while is that your actions become character. And that's the thing, which I don't think that Marx and Engels really realized. They just thought that we're counting the money, and that's why we're open-minded and cosmopolitan. Yes, in a way, perhaps it starts that way. We make money instead of making war. But then once we do that, we realize that we have something in common with others, with outsiders, and with foreigners as well. And that then it starts to change. Then it's not just money. Then it turns into empathy. It turns into sharing parts of our identity with others as well. So I think then after a while it becomes more of our character, and it's not set in stone, and it can go into reverse. We've seen that historically, but at least this is the opening up that begins to dismantle some of our tribalism, or at least keeps it in check.
You can trigger a cultural shift and a change in the mindset as well. Yes, I think that's a very salient point. And we were just sort of ruminating there over what could be next after nation states. There has been quite a lot of interest in civilizationalism over the last few years, especially interestingly enough, since Trump was elected to the White House in 2016. I think it was Huntington that defined civilizations as basically the highest entity to which one can belong, at least a non-religious entity, one step lower than humanity. And there's still a lot of ambiguity over exactly which civilization is which, and exactly if there are any hard sort of definitions for it. But it's something we've been talking about on this show recently, and I've had a couple of guests on who have written quite extensively about this political ideology in many countries now, especially what you might say, non-Western rising powers, be they Russia, China, India, and Turkey, have all, in one way or another, have their own sort of take on a sort of a civilizational narrative. And so from the perspective of liberalism, it seems like a closing of the door and a retreat into one's own sort of nativist culture, and that seems like a retreat from globalism in the short term. However, as your book shows, many of the great open societies reached their zenith whilst being civilizations. To me, it feels like civilizations need to be cosmopolitan in order to be worthy of the name. Do you feel that civilizational ideology among certain states now in the 21st century may, in the long term, foster more open societies? Johan, what do you think?
Yeah, here's to hoping, because there's a paradox here, because all these great civilizations, when they talk about, we used to be strong and powerful in the past and making rapid progress, we used to be the center of the world with rapid scientific and technological progress. They're right. That's true. That has been the case in almost any civilization. We've seen it in China during the Song dynasty, for example. We saw it in the Arab world during the early Abbasid Caliphate. We've seen it in India, in Turkey, in Iran, Persian Empire at various points. That has been the case. But that was in that precise moment in time that those civilizations were the most open, when they were self-confident, so that they reached out to others and borrowed the best astronomers and entrepreneurs and warriors, mind you, and engineers from other places, so that they could make use of more brains and more talent from other parts of the globe. And that's their challenge today, because when they're trying to make their civilizations strong or great again, what they're often saying is that they will now do it by setting themselves apart from the others, talking about what's unique to their identity in contrast with the others, and often with a tendency towards self-sufficiency and a certain nationalist form of arrogance. And that's something that can often motivate people in the short run, talking about how powerful and strong you are in contrast to all the others. But if you want to be strong in the long run, you have to be open in the way these civilizations were when they dominated the planet. So that's the key question right now. What are they going to do? Are they going to focus on trying to be closed or open? And I think the jury's still out, and I think that we'll see various experiences in certain places. I'm definitely worried about what goes on in certain places. It's more of the beating of the war drums and economic strategic self-reliance and things like that. And that's bad for the world, because it might lead to more of zero-sum games between different regions rather than mutual benefits. But it's also bad for those civilizations in the short run. I don't think that you'll make your civilization great in that way.
Yes, it's definitely, and this is what Anvesh Jain, one of the guests on our show recently talked about, is typically civilizationalists think in centuries. They don't think in several years or who's going to win the next election. He's read a lot of their writings, and they are often talking about, for example, rebuilding Indian greatness, into the next century or the century after that. And so it is a bit of a hard one to pin down, and so we'll have to see where it goes. But I suppose in the short term, if you could fast track it to having restored your cultural pride whilst keeping the trade flowing and the borders open, then that would probably be the best of both worlds. But we'll see, Johan. It's an interesting space. Cities are also an important theme in the book. And you quote Watson, who writes that cities are, quote, the cradle of culture, the birthplace of nearly all our most cherished ideas, end quote. So I'd like to ask you about cities and nation states from the perspective of which is better built to support open global systems. There are times in the book where you lament the absurdity of concerns over trade deficits and trade surpluses, but especially deficits, right? Pointing out that we don't make these kinds of complaints when we compare cities or suburbs. We only make these kinds of arguments when we're, for example, China and US or some other two countries. That's when politicians start to use this rhetoric. Oh, we have a trade deficit with whichever country, and that's terrible. So could you see potentially more autonomous cities, such as charter cities, perhaps breaking this kind of interstate deadlock that we see today? And do you see cities as taking on a larger role in the 21st century in terms of a renewed globalization that keeps the systems open?
Good question. Yes, I write a lot about cities, and that's because they are the crucible of modern civilization, I would say. Jane Jacobs, the urban prophet, she wrote that cities are different in many ways. They're not like small towns, only larger. One of the main differences is that cities are by definition full of strangers. So we rub up against strangers constantly. And if you look at the history of innovation, of science, of technology, you notice that progress comes from these serendipitous meetings when different fields of experience, of science, of will meet and cross-fertilize one another. And that tends to happen in places in urban clusters where lots of people meet constantly, and it's hard not to be constantly disturbed and inspired by what goes on across the street. And so it's not that cities are better in themselves, but it's just sort of they're full of strangers, and that's why we need it. And yeah, I mean, you can repeat that experience online as well, perhaps nowadays, but not this kind of serendipity where it just happens even if you don't want it to happen. And that's why they will continue to be powerhouses. That's where people move to get more not just employment, but also to live the kind of life that they are interested in, develop their own identity, and find others who share their interests. And that's why I think they'll also will continue to be the main engine behind globalization in the future as well, because between these urban clusters, we see these combinations constantly, and how they learn from one another and how they constantly exchange ideas and people and other things. And there are interesting experiments. You can see that in different ways. It could be in terms of policy, how sometimes when you don't see much action on the national level, cities begin to communicate and discuss, is there something we could do about climate change? Is there something we can do when it comes to migration, when it comes to trade? But also in terms of, I would say that the idea of charter cities, the idea that you could go different ways as as a different as a particular city. And I think that globalization has made us realize two things. First of all, it has made us realize that sometimes the nation state is much too small for many of our problems. We need to come to mutual ground with other nations as well and find different multilateral ways for the new solutions. But globalization has also revealed that the nation state is too big for many of our smaller problems. And we can often see that decentralization and experiments in certain cities and local communities can often be a better way forward than national one-size-fits-all solutions.
And there's also these other kinds of things happening. Seasteading is this kind of new movement as well that people are interested in, sort of taking this concept to the waves. And so then the city does not have to be, well, I'm not sure if it would quite be a city, but whatever, the community would not have to be quite fixed to one particular geography. That hasn't really sort of picked up, but there's a lot of interest in that. It's a funny time, I think, for cities because of COVID. It seems that most of the activity in what we traditionally thought were the exciting cities of the world has very much mellowed out, and especially in the States, you see a lot of people moving sort of into the hinterland and to smaller cities and out of the coastal areas. But in other countries like India, urbanization is going ahead full steam. So it's definitely they are such important centers for openness, and I think, as you put it very well, like the serendipitous connections, things where I met my wife on the side of a street side cafe in Taipei. Had no intention of there was no online arrangement or no app involved. It was just very serendipitous. Was not particularly looking for someone at that point in time. It just happened. So these the kinds of things that cities are famous for. So Johan, I'm also interested. We actually just briefly mentioned caste system and jumping around a little bit, but staying with India for a moment. But also, I'd like to broaden it out a little more to the role of traders throughout human history across different civilizations. I recently was comparing the role of traders or entrepreneurs with an Indian scholar when we were talking about sort of India and China and traditional cultures there. But your book made me realize that actually the same can be said of Romans and Greeks. So what am I saying? Well, basically that the upper strata, the higher in the higher echelons of society in ancient Rome and Greece, trading was considered a bit beneath them, as I think I can say, quote from your book, a dirty necessary task. So that's kind of strange because you also affirm that traders are the instigators of much exchange throughout history. So in India, we have the Vaishya caste, which is the second lowest if you don't bring in, the Dalits or the untouchables. And so that, maybe a mid-ranking, you could say, at the highest. And then in China, the Shang, which means business person or trader, was actually the lowest ranking of, wouldn't say caste, but ranking in their sort of traditional occupations. So, is there a reason for this seeming universal contempt in ancient societies for traders? And is it simply that, as you point out, trade is so innate to human nature that it was something they considered anyone could do and so just ignored it a little bit? Or is there another reason there I'm missing? I'm just curious. Yeah.
That's a great question. It's one of the big paradoxes in human history. The profession that has brought us most of the ideas and the technologies and the wealth that we enjoy is really the one that we've always looked down upon. And I think that, yes, one of the reasons is that trade is innate. The first signs that archaeologists have found of long distance trade is 300,000 years old in Kenya. And that's approximately the same age as Homo sapiens in themselves. So we've always bartered and exchanged with others. So it might be like it's not an elite form of behavior. It's what everybody does. You can see it in kindergarten. The kids start to exchange whatever they have with others. And in a way, it is a little bit like, and I only thought of this parallel now, so it might not make sense. But one of the reasons why some cities started to thrive, some areas started to make rapid progress in terms of health and wealth, was that they managed to fix for the first time their garbage collection services, and to fix the wastewater treatment, and just basically making sure that excrements did not end up in the same place where you got your water. So this is the key to human survival, to fix this one thing. But doing that, being the garbage collector, being the person who deals with your waste, has never been seen as sort of this is something we should cherish. Yeah, exactly. No one opens their windows and applaud their profession, but it's the most important one we have in human civilization, potentially. And perhaps it's something similar with trade. It just seems like something dirty, and you do it for your own self-interest. And we might need it to be wealthy as a society, but we don't particularly like it. And especially in previous eras that were dominated by sort of this warrior mentality, that the kings were constantly waging war. The kings and the aristocrats and the feudal lords were constantly making war or planning for the next war. So the traders, they were the ones who sneaked across borders and paid the opponents for goods and services that we needed. So it's really low, right? Because the best thing is to kill and steal from the others,
disloyal,
not to
I suppose.
Profit. Yeah. Exactly. It's almost disloyal, and it's bad. So then they don't even pay adherence to sort of our warrior mentality in our civilization. That has been an important reason traditionally as well.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of a famous phrase that we say in Chinese, which is that business people, or traders, you can say, don't really have a nationality. That's a phrase. So that's indicative of what you're talking about. Exactly, like you can cross over to the other side, and you have no true loyalty, etc. There's so many fascinating things we're exploring, Johan. Now I'm really excited because this is something I've been thinking about for quite some time. But I think your book gives me a fantastic opportunity to phrase this question and ask you your opinion. I'd like to talk about monotheism and polytheism and the fostering of plurality. There are several examples in your book, such as when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, or when the Spanish reinvaded or reclaimed the Iberian Peninsula from Muslims. And at those times, there was an ensuing crackdown on religious pluralism. And so if we look, for example, at Hinduism as underlying India's great traditions of religious tolerance, there seems to be kind of maybe a difference we can talk about in terms of polytheism and pluralism. So what your book sort of illustrated to me is that kind of pre-Christian Rome was very similar in terms of the pantheon of the gods. And so there was a great quote where you mentioned, I'm not sure if it was perhaps Caesar or another general or another Roman leader, overcame the tribespeople of a particular area and entered their village and said, "Well, we accept and worship whatever gods you worship here." It was very much a practical polytheism, but it did bring all of the different cultures within the Roman Empire sort of under one umbrella together. And so I guess, we do see, of course, very severe sectarian violence between Muslims and Hindus in India, right? But we rarely see sectarian violence between, for example, Taoists and Buddhists in China or in Taiwan, where I am. Since temples here, for example, in Taiwan, you'll often worship Buddhist and Taoist deities in the same place, so these it's kind of like the pantheon I was just speaking about, this kind of polytheistic outlook. So my hunch is that it is, of course, possible to have thriving cosmopolitanism in monotheistic jurisdictions, of course, but it might be easier to do so in polytheistic ones. I don't know how you feel about that. That's my idea. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that monotheism we've learned over the centuries is fairly fluid as well. You can always
Uh-huh.
emphasize different parts of your beliefs to make it open or closed, but it's definitely easier if you're polytheistic. And what I write about in the book is that many of the great or awful, depending on how you look at it, warrior civilizations, the empires that were rapidly built. It's always been a puzzle to historians. Why is it that they manage in such a short period of time? Sort of Macedonia or a small Mongol tribe managed to take large parts of the world and conquer it. And one of the reasons, and they talked a lot about military technology, but I think much more important is their strategic tolerance. They were all, relatively speaking, open, not in a sort of nice, liberal, warm, fuzzy way because they killed those who objected to their rule. But once they conquered a place, they basically said, as it was not Caesar, it was Publius Servius who said this when they conquered this tribe, sort of, yes, we acknowledge and recognize whatever gods you happen to have here. And that's the perfect sort of form of strategic tolerance, because it's also a way to create a certainty, safety, and a belief for the subjected people that, okay, they're not here to uproot what we're doing. They're here to gain power, but they keep often the local power structure intact, and the beliefs, the ideas, and began to recognize that as well. That's what Alexander the Great did. That's actually what Genghis Khan did with his Mongolian empire. An incredibly vicious warlord, but within the empire, religious freedom and tolerance, and the Romans were the experts who really sort of, they basically just took every new god and turned it into a version of their old god, a new aspect of an older
Mm.
god. So,
Mm.
I mean, the greatest example is the Egyptian goddess Isis,
Okay.
because she was also seen as the Athenian Pallas Athena. That was the same thing. The Cretans, Diana, the Sicilians, Proserpina, and so on and so on. So
Mm.
basically, it's so easy in that case to accept local beliefs and myths and ideologies, rather than saying you have to abide by our idea here in
Mm.
Rome, but rather, no, you've got great ideas, great local deities, and we pray to them as well in our own way. And that's the way to pray together in a temple rather than doing something else. But then historically, as you say, once one sect gains power and believes that this is the one version of the future, like the
Mm.
Christians in Rome, like what we saw in Spain, which we've seen in the 16th century, what we saw in when certain more intolerant versions of Islam has taken power, is that it has destroyed and harassed the minorities, and it has also ended the golden eras in those places because that was
Mm.
dependent on that openness.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating sort of look at the role of religion and how that sort of fosters these kinds of cultures. I also think, I suppose, in 20th century, in, I guess, the West, broadly speaking, in the 20th century, where many countries, but especially the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., became much more multicultural and much more diverse over the course of the 20th century. I suppose, and you could say the same in France, I suppose, a real commitment to secularism instead of, being defined by as Christian countries would have probably fostered a lot of that tolerance as well. Yeah. I also am curious about Europe here, sort of segue into Europe, sort of speaking about the West, because you have this great explanation as to perhaps why Europe uh, was kind of the exception in how it came about, fostering modernity, towards, the later centuries. And yeah, you sort of spin conventional wisdom on its head a little bit by saying it was more that the Europeans were not very good at suppressing new ideas as opposed to other parts of the world. But I think what's most interesting, what I really got out of that, was the geography of Europe and how that made it so much harder for despots to sort of quash particular, blasphemous or unorthodox ideas. So you refer to this as well. Actually, no. This is just my spin on it. I think we have this idea of the concert of Europe that came later in the 19th century, where the states stabilized their borders, in Europe. But I think what you describe is more what you might call a cacophony of Europe, in the centuries before that, where you have this disunity on the continent, and so sort of wild ideas were allowed to flourish. And that was because, well, I'll let you explain. Like, why was that? Why was it so hard to sort of unite Europe and keep it under sort of a centralized control? Because the Romans did it a long time ago, but then it never sort of happened again, in the last millennium, I suppose. So anyway, over to you, Johan. I just think it's a great insight. Yes.
Well, and that's a great concept, the cacophony of Europe. I should have used that in the book. It's really great. I'll steal it.
You do that, yeah.
Which is what we do with all great ideas. That's how we make progress. Yeah, I think Europe was lucky because, as I try to show in my book, is that golden eras are ended at one point or another because the elite, or the new elite, fears openness or bases its power on a certain status quo and doesn't want to rock the boat in any way. And the thing is that the elite, the church and the kings and the feudal lords in Europe, they did exactly the same thing as rulers had done in the Arab world, in China, the emperor in China and so on. They also tried to block progress. When they faced Renaissance and Enlightenment ideas, and when they saw the first forms of manufacturing and the early industrial revolution, they tried to stop it and block it and destroy it and harass the eccentrics and entrepreneurs, just as they've done in other places. But they failed. That's what sets Europe apart, and partly out of geographical coincidence, because at the beginning of the 16th century there were around 500 more or less independent political units in Europe.
It's amazing.
Countries, independent cities, universities with their own jurisdiction, and ruled by various lords, and none of them was sort of open and liberal and wanted free markets and free speech, but they couldn't coordinate their repression. And that makes it different. And when you can't coordinate repression, what happens is that, you can move to that particular place where your version of blasphemy is accepted. So books that couldn't be printed in a Catholic country, you could do it in Amsterdam. John Locke could go to the Dutch Republic. Hobbes could go to Paris. Grotius, whose ideas were persecuted in the Dutch Republic, he could go to France, whereas Descartes could go in the other direction, but for the same reason, to spread their own ideas.
It's
and this
fascinating.
It's partly a geographical coincidence. We're like in Europe, a peninsula with all these rivers and mountain chains and marshlands, and even within places like Spain and the Netherlands, you had many local and regional authorities with a large degree of independence, because it was costly to cross all that land and try to unify it. It was difficult because of that geography. The Romans managed, but that was really the Mediterranean. You could easily cross the Mediterranean and become the great power there. But this large land area of Europe could never be unified. Many tried, but they all failed. Whereas the Chinese emperor, if he came up with a great idea, if he wanted progress and trade, China became the greatest power on the planet. But the moment the Chinese emperor decided, no, we don't want international trade and these large armadas to discover the world. That was the end of it. And they burned the boats, and we got 500 years of stagnation in China. Whereas in Europe, many did the same thing. I mean, it wasn't easy for Columbus to go to America because he was rejected by the King of England and the King of France, whom he turned to, and different feudal lords in Italy, and by the Portuguese court. But in Europe, he could continue to search for a sponsor. And in the end, he found the Spanish court, who said that, okay, let's try it and go. And that was it. Whereas in China, it was the end of it after the first rejection.
This is very keen insights. And I think there's something there that's still relevant for us today. I mean, China does feature quite heavily in the book. And your descriptions of the Song and Yuan and Ming dynasties quite illuminating, especially in terms of this cycle of opening and closing and various high points and sort of withdrawals from the global system. We are now in a particularly interesting point in time. Of course, China opened up and reformed, under Deng Xiaoping 30, 40 years ago, and now it's made so much progress and has become such a big outsized influence on the world stage, but now things are changing very quickly. And I just wonder what you make of Xi Jinping's China at this point in time, and just given the history that you just referred to there, and the concept of a one man having that sort of authority to basically steer the ship whichever way he may please. It's always been except for once during the Tang Dynasty, it's always been a he, unfortunately. So it's I just wonder, what do you think about I guess where the People's Republic of China is poised at this particular point in time, given that history and the centralization that you were just talking about?
Yes, this is a key question for China and for the world, I think, because what we have just seen is that the pendulum has swung again in Chinese history. We'll see how long it lasts and what the results are. But we had with many caveats, it was an amazing run from the late 1970s until the early 2010s, I'd say, in
roughly,
China.
Yes.
If I had to mark a year, it's 2010, basically.
Okay.
It began to open up, and rapid progress, not because of any great plan from the top, because of grassroots initiatives. The villages who secretly privatized their land, the village enterprises that they built. I have to break and tell my cat not to do this to the curtains.
Okay, sure.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yep. Yes, go on. Yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So China made rapid progress since the late 1970s because of grassroots initiatives. It was the secret privatization of land that broke down the local communes. It was village enterprises. It was the unemployed youth in cities who demanded their right to start businesses. And then it was businesses who experimented in the export processing zones. All of these things on the margins. And what Deng and the leadership did was not having a great plan for China's future. It was that they accepted the things that were already working and instead of putting people in prison for taking these initiatives, they allowed them to do it, and they allowed them to do it on a national basis as well. And that's really what started it. And then Xi Jinping ended it. And I think it began earlier because of the same thing that we've seen in after many golden eras. Certain parts of the elite begin to feel threatened. And this was the sort of the propaganda machinery within the party. It was within the security forces. It was within the army. They began to see that some of these reforms were beginning to threaten their monopolies, their power, and they got a spokesman in Xi Jinping. I think two things happened at the same time. First of all, we had the Great Recession around the world, and suddenly the Communist Party in China began to think that, okay, the West is on its knees. This neoliberal open era is over. and they've lost, and they also failed with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So perhaps this is our moment. On the other hand, they also saw the color revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, it was the Arab Spring. So they had this renewed sense that, oh gosh, if we don't, and this was their interpretation, if we don't centralize power, we could lose it all. So these two things combined, I think, swayed opinion within the dominating forces towards a new era of centralization. Instead of progressing with reforms, continuing with opening up, they had to retrench and centralize power. And that's what Xi Jinping has done. And this is brand new in China's history. When people say that, look, it's a successful model, I'd say it's much too early to say, because it's only been in place for some 10 years now, with this retrenchment, both politically, new harsh repression, and at the same time centralizing the economy, destroying entrepreneurs if they in any way do not fit the plan. What Deng would have done when he saw this thriving tech industry, for example, was to say, look, this could be our way to conquer the world economy. Whereas for Xi, he looks at it and says, this is a new power center. I don't like it. Let's destroy them and humiliate them. And so far, the result has been economic failure. We've seen the growth rates have collapsed. We are seeing it now with Evergrande and the whole housing sector, how it is falling apart. So I think China is now in a closed moment in time. And for those around the world who say that, look, this is dangerous, it's a new form of Maoist authoritarianism, and they're about to conquer the world, I would say precisely that thing that makes China seem so scary right now is the thing that puts a limit to its ability to conquer the world, because it is right now destroying that very openness that historically has been the key to China's success.
Very nuanced perspective there, Johan. And I'd often thought about the role that, the influence the 2008 GFC and the war on terror has had in terms of Chinese perceptions of Western weakness, but not quite the color revolution. I like the way you kind of combine those two together, the sense of opportunity and the sense of a potential threat combined together. That's another explanation I quite appreciate. Thank you for those ideas. I just would like to extend that a little bit, because of course now you're just referring to this sense of threat. Maybe the Marxists in Beijing are going to take over the world and everything. And of course, there is. I'm in Taiwan. There is definitely some cause to be concerned for Chinese aggression. However, it can easily. We can easily lose our sort of heads worrying about these things and catastrophizing to some extent. However, having said all that, I want to ask how you feel about the competition between the US and China, because it seems that could be settling in for quite a long competition between the US, its allies, and China. And on the one hand, it seems very ominous, but because both countries could risk becoming less open in the process, and there could even be kinetic war. But on the other hand, as you point out in the book, we often cooperate together in order to beat a rival, as we said earlier. Could it be US-China competition, if managed well, and that's a big caveat, but if it is managed well, it could actually be a real boon for human progress if it generates a lot of new innovation? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, that's a very interesting and hopeful perspective. And before I share my ideas on that, let me just say a couple of words about this rivalry, because I think that we might have been in certain areas a little bit naive about what is going on in China, especially after 2010. It's difficult to say that any business or any organization is really private in China, because the Communist Party has really begun to centralize everything and turned every independent force into a marionette for their own power. So we have to look again at Chinese investments abroad. I mean, I don't mind if they sell me cheap steel and a nice, decent car. But I am worried when they buy infrastructure, when they're in some of our tech systems, some of our digital infrastructure as well. I would look at that more closely. I also think that the liberal democracies have been very bad at sticking together when China has sort of attacked and picked us off one by one. Be it Australia saying something offensive about actually looking into the history of the coronavirus, or be it Norway who promotes human rights. China attacks them economically in using trade as a stick to beat them up. I think we should stick together more. I think there's room for more cooperation when it comes to security in the Pacific between liberal democracies, because there's by no means a sort of a natural and unavoidable Chinese region just because it happens to be a big country, because the liberal democracies in the region are bigger and more people and more economic power. China is still a poor country. I mean, on a per capita basis, it's as rich as Gabon and the Dominican Republic. I mean, it's just that they're 1.4 billion, so that it's a big economy. So I think there's room for that. But I do worry a lot about this new Western idea that there's always a geopolitical rivalry and that we have to beat them up with trade wars and try to splinter the world in two tech civilizations and two different internets and so on. I think it would be a big and costly mistake that would hurt our economies as well. But I also think that this pushes China into a corner, because we tend to think of China as a monolith. And sort of it's the Politburo speaking.
How it presents itself, typically.
Exactly. That's how they want to be seen. But there's a continued rivalry within the power sector of China as well. And that has been ongoing for well, at least after Mao's death. And well, even before that. And what has happened now is that because we've had Trump, but also Biden continue with many of these policies, even the liberals within China have begun to see, okay, there's no other route for us than self-sufficiency and going it alone in many areas where we could have had much more cooperation, much more openness with the rest of the world. So I think we have to keep those two things apart. Think of one area for open negotiations, cooperation, and exchange. The other one about security, about defending human rights and defending peace. Those are two separate areas, and we have to treat them separately. Otherwise, there's the risk that we push everybody in China into the geopolitical rivalry corner, and then we create an enemy that's not necessarily always there for us. And then to your question, so might this speed up progress? I think so. That's the history speaks fairly loudly on that point. Again, we have so much natural conservatism and laziness, and we're comfortable with what we have. We don't want to proceed when it comes to biotechnological engineering or new strange mRNA vaccines or with AI or what have you, because it feels a little bit threatening. But if the others are doing it, we're going to have to do it. And I think this is one of the things that have now speeded up technological progress in all around the world, because now we think it's a necessity. The prospect of being hanged in the morning focuses the mind splendidly, as Samuel Johnson put it once. And I think sort of the prospect of somebody else beating us to the goal, that's always some kind of Sputnik moment that focuses minds.
Yes, Sputnik moment is quite right. Johan, I just have to plug in my computer because I'm on a laptop. Just a moment.
Sure.
Yes. Okay, fine. Okay. Yeah, no, I quite agree. A Sputnik moment, it is indeed. But if everyone in China are basically what we say in America, hawks. Sorry, not doves, hawks, and the same happens in the U.S., then Graham Allison's prediction about the Thucydides trap may indeed come into reality, and that would be quite a travesty for us all. So we do still need to retain some sort of balance, even if there are things that need to be pushed back against in regards to China's foreign policy. So, Johan, toward the end of the book, you give us some fascinating examples of what you call like fluid tribalism, and so I sort of earmarked this a bit earlier in our conversation. There is quite a distressing story involving a nun in Rwanda who picks and chooses between religious and ethnic identities, which leads to the deaths of many innocent people. You quote E.O. Wilson, who says that, quote, human beings are consistent in their codes of honor, but endlessly fickle with reference to whom the codes apply, end quote. So do you think we can take advantage of this fluidity to better counter tribalisms and divisiveness? Perhaps we covered this with the discussion about internet and plural identities a bit earlier, but there's another thinker I'd like to put out there, and that's Benedict Anderson. His idea of nation states essentially being imagined communities. Do we sort of just need to enlarge our imaginations here, Johan, or could there be another way to get beyond this kind of tribal instinct? What do you think about that?
Yeah, we're going to have to.
Somehow,
and
yeah.
I think that, first of all, I think that we know that our tribalism is incredibly fluid, and we constantly change who is us and who is them. And you can look at everything from how we treat recent waves of immigrants, for example. And I write a lot about the American experience. How, first of all, the us was the Anglo-Saxon in the US, and the them was the Germans and the Scandinavians and Swedes, because they came from this weird authoritarian place and they would never fit into American society. But obviously, after a while, people began to see, oh, they're just like us, basically. But now it's the Italians and the Irish; they are the dangerous ones. And every new wave of migrants in most places are treated as them for a while, until we realize that they're also parents and hard workers, and they contribute to society. And after a while, we begin to see all the things we have in common against them, the next wave of migrants.
Yeah.
And that's bad news, and it's good news. It's bad news because it means that tribalism will always be there, and we'll always find new outgroups. But the good news is that we constantly shift perspective, and we broaden that circle constantly. We're doing it all the time. And even the sort of the most recent stories we've heard of angry tribalism, to me, the most interesting thing is that they're so new. I mean, look at the Brexit issue in Britain. Suddenly everybody defined themselves as a Brexiteer or as a Remainer. And I think I put it in the book. I think it was the summer of 2019. 87% defined themselves as whether they wanted to leave the European Union or stay in the European Union. And that was actually 15 percentage points more than had even bothered to vote in the referendum on leaving the European Union. And that tells you something about how a new divide can suddenly become salient. And it's the tell-all and end-all of our tribalism for a while. And that tells us both how demagogues can easily sway us and tell us that there's just one part of your identity that's important, and everybody who's there, they're your friends, and everybody else is the enemy. And it's dangerous, and we have to be very, very cautious about that and fight it. But it also tells us that there is a way out of it all by focusing on the other things that we have in common, and constantly shift that grouping and find out what we have in common with those other groups. We can find new imagined communities, and I think we do that all the time, as long as we're not sort of drowned out by demagogues who have an axe to grind.
Yes, no, the threat of demagogues is quite a pertinent one. And it seems there's always a demagogue lurking around the corner whenever there are tough times. It seems the next thing that follows is some sort of opportunist to make use of those kinds of divisions. But yeah, I guess in the recycling process, perhaps there's more fluidity there. Maybe that tendency can be a little less intense, or at least perhaps the victims of the outgroup that are the potential victims at any particular time. Perhaps it's only a few years until they're included and sort of the discrimination they face. Although there are obviously groups that have seem to be picked on, consistently throughout history. But there is, as you mentioned, a sort of a cyclical nature to it, or things move on. That does give some sort of a silver outline to the cloud, I suppose, Johan. I just enjoyed so much of your book, and I found it such a refreshing affirmation of so much I personally believe in, but I don't quite see enough books out there like yours, actually. Ones that are unequivocally calling for a return to a cosmopolitan world. I mean, I'm sure people often put you, alongside Steven Pinker and other thinkers like this, but it seems that many authors are happy to catch the trending wave of explaining our new era of decoupling, populism, great power competition, you name it, whatever is the next great threat to our world order. And whilst these are things to be aware of, I don't think that really tells the whole story. But I just wonder how you feel as the author of a book like this. Do you find it's easier to get attention because you're bucking the trend and giving a more optimistic sort of spin on things? Or is it harder for you to get books out there like this, given that your title and your cover, the open hand, might not really hit people's panic buttons and sort of, get them sort of, what's this? It doesn't quite create the same sense of urgency or panic, I suppose. What do you think in your personal experience as a writer? Yeah.
Well, personally, I love being a contrarian. And one of the reasons why I write books is that I look at the what is the mainstream today? What's the common take on current events? And if it's wrong, I want to write about why it's wrong. So I don't mind being a contrarian, and it gives me a certain niche in being more hopeful, I think. But on the other hand, I'm in a small minority, at least when it comes to writers on current events and on history. And my agent keeps on telling me that if you were to write that book about how the world ends, then I'll make you a rich man, because that's really what people want to read. And I think that's a part of human nature as well. If someone comes with bad news, it seems like he worries about you, he has your back, he wants to warn you about something dangerous. But if someone comes with good news, it sounds like he's trying to sell you something. It's like, that thing that you're worrying about, I think we have a solution. That's a little bit scary.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I think that's one. And there was actually a study in social psychology where people read reviews of books where the reviews were exactly the same and they had the same kind of intellectual ambition. The only difference was that one was angry with the book and one loved the book. And then people were being asked, so who's the smartest of the reviewers? Who's got the highest IQ? And everybody thought that the person who warned you about the book and told you it's bad, that was the clever guy, because he saw the problems of the world. Well, I think you can see the problems of the world, but also look at solutions as well. And I hope that there's a market for that. But sometimes it does feel like you're lonely when you do that.
What's next? Do you have another book in the pipeline? Are there any plans at the moment?
I actually just did a documentary for American public television on crony capitalism. I love free markets.
That's pretty dark.
and I love capitalism, but I really hate crony capitalism. When businesses don't compete with having the best goods and services, but rather the best connections with politicians and get the tariffs, the subsidies, tax exemptions, bailouts, and so on. So yeah, that's a. I look at some of the problems of the world, so that should be a success.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Johan, I'll have to. I'm looking out for that. There's always a question I love to ask all my guests at the end of the show. What do you feel are some of the greatest lessons you've learned in your career that you think people in policy ought to be aware of? And it can be anything. It can be personal, anecdote. It can be any observation at all. What do you think?
I think that what I've learned, and I write about it more and more, whatever I do, is sort of Socratic wisdom, and the fact that the most important thing to know is the limits of your knowledge. And where I've found that the most is when I look at everything that we hold dear, everything that we love and cherish and want to protect against a dangerous world. They were once seen as worthless and stupid or even dangerous by most people, and particularly by the elites. And that could be sort of the personal computer and bioengineering, but even trivial things like the bicycle and the umbrella. Whenever someone started to use things like this and come up to, look, I've got a great way of protecting yourself against the rain. People don't like that. They hate it. And the first guy who used it in London, on the rainy streets of London in the 18th century, he was attacked and harassed by people. And the coach drivers even tried to run him over because they thought it looked silly. It looked feminine. He was almost behaving like he was French, which was quite a put down in England in those days. But also it would lead to creative destruction. The old jobs for coach drivers would end because they had those protected wagons against the rain. So if people had umbrellas, it would ruin their whole industry. So they hated it. And the more I look at history, the more I look at everything that we hold dear, from umbrellas to democracy, to books, to the internet, people just hated it. And that tells me something important that I think everybody should think about. All the new things, all the novelty, all the weird experiments that crazy people come up with, perhaps we should give them some time and count to 10 before we say that that's just bad, because that seems to be part of human nature. We just like our old ways.
Very wise words, Johan. I think there are so many things right now in our world, developing as rapidly as it is, that are just plain weird and strange. And there's no end to the number of things that elites, whether it's in the financial system, political worlds, etc., business, are happy to criticize and ridicule and things. I can think of half a dozen off the top of my head right away, but there are just so many of those kinds of things out there. And but if you look at the arc of history and realize, like that umbrella thing, I didn't realize that at all. That's hilarious, actually. But that shows just how fickle we are about things. And I think that really gives us, and that's what your book is about. I mean, it is, of course, about human progress and cultures and economics and trade, yes, but it's also about human nature. I think that's a big part of it. That's what lies at the heart of your book. It's a very well done exploration of what it is to be human and why we do things the way we do, and the cycles of things that we create because of our impulses, as you so well put it there. So I just really think there's been so many valuable insights we've had in our episode today, and there's so much more that people in policy can learn from you. So I highly encourage people to check out your books, and of course we'll have links to those in the show notes. And we look forward to next time and to your future work. So thank you so much, Johan, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Liam. This was very interesting and great fun.
Okay. Okay, just can you clap? Yeah, just cut it out. Yep, brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. It was so much fun, and
yeah, this was great.
Yes, and I
enjoyed it.
Where can I find your documentary?
It's actually available everywhere now, streaming
really?
online. So on YouTube,
Recording
for example.
stopped.
Oh, on YouTube. Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, and you're at Cato as well as a non-resident fellow, right?
Yes, so it's not really my employer, but it's an affiliation. So I go there once in a while for lectures and stuff. But most of the time I spend in Sweden.
Yeah, I saw you had a brief talk on China on there as well. Yeah,
Right, yeah.
just recently. So it got my me thinking about maybe some questions for you and stuff. So okay, so yeah, you're mostly in Sweden there at the university, and then you got that set up with Cato as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'm very
right.
conscious of the time, Johan. So thank you so much for your generosity with your time, and I hope we can connect again and have a lovely weekend and everything. Thank you so much.
Sure. That would be fun. Thank you. You too.
I'll
Take care.
link the episode when it's out. Probably week after next. I think it'll be
Great.
Yeah. Okay, mid-October. Okay. Have a lovely day.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Oh.